If you'll please open your Bibles back to 1 Corinthians chapter 1. 1 Corinthians chapter 1. Good to see everybody back with us tonight. Hope you've had a good afternoon. Let me mention a few things very quickly that are pertinent to not only this week but the next few weeks. Number one, we have the information on the arrangements for Miss Sandra's services. The visitation will be Tuesday evening from 5 to 8 o'clock at Dyersburg Funeral Home. And then the service will be held in the chapel at Dyersburg Funeral Home at 3 o'clock Wednesday afternoon. So visitation is 5 to 8 Tuesday night, and then service at 3 o'clock Wednesday afternoon. On that note, for those who normally attend our Wednesday morning Bible class, we will be foregoing that this week. So go ahead and mark that in your calendars. We will not have class this Wednesday morning, and that way there will be no problems with everybody doing what all needs to be done regarding those services. Also, ladies, don't forget the upcoming Ladies Retreat, March the 6th and the 7th at Ken Lake State Resort in Aurora, Kentucky. The deadline to sign up, though, is February 11th. After that, the rooms will be released, and well, you could still book them, but you will not get them at the cheaper rate. So if you're planning on going to that, please sign up as soon as you can. There's only been a couple of rooms taken so far, and the sooner you sign up for that, the better. As far as scheduling and getting those rooms booked are concerned. So please do that as soon as you can so that we can go on and making arrangements with the Ladies Retreat. This morning we began to conclude our sermon series that we've had ongoing this month surrounding this idea of being better Christians, better servants, better husbands and wives and citizens and workers and anything we do, anybody that we are, we should always be in a state of mind where we're seeking to be better in those areas. And of course, the discussion that we could have surrounding how we can be better as Christians or servants or husbands or wives or children or anything, that could be practically ongoing for months and months and months and months. What we've tried to do in this month is capture some thoughts that Paul expressed to Timothy in 1 Timothy 4:13. Around the idea of until Paul was able to rejoin Timothy in his work. Paul said he wanted Timothy to give special attention, special consideration to some key Christian attributes or some key Christian activities that Paul not only hoped Timothy would give passing attention to, but as he went on to say in verses 15 and 16 that he would give diligence to, that he would give himself to wholly, that they would begin to consume his lifestyle and begin to mold his identity as a person. And those three things that Paul mentioned in 1 Timothy 4:13 was, number one, the idea of being a better student, a better reader and studier of the Bible. Number two, this idea of being an encourager, looking to build up those around us rather than continually seeking to tear one another down. And then today we've been spending some time talking about how that we as Christians and as servants and as husbands and wives and children, friends, and any role that we play in life can be ultimately better, at least in view of our ultimate purpose of leading souls to heaven, if we would each and every one commit to being a teacher, that is, a teacher of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And regardless of what the world may say or think or do to those who are committed and devoted to teaching the gospel of Christ, we have to keep in mind those primary thoughts we looked at in 1 Corinthians chapter 1. About how that even in the first century, yes, the preaching of the gospel was an enigma to the world. It was foolishness. But Paul said that it pleased God by the foolishness of preaching to save those that believe. That doesn't just include those who might stand behind a pretty little pulpit like this. That's in reference to every single child of God who has been called to do the work of an evangelist, as Paul also said to young Timothy. And so today we've been looking at asking and answering 5 questions surrounding this idea of being teachers. And the first 2 we looked at this morning was, number 1, what we need to teach. And of course the simple answer is that we need to be devoted to teaching the gospel of Christ and nothing but the gospel. And of course that excludes the error that we see in the religious world around us, as we clearly noted, but it also means that we as Christians are able to discern truth from tradition or doctrine from dogma. And that in trying to represent what we claim to be the gospel of Christ, that we ensure that it is the gospel of Christ and not merely the opinions or the traditions of men. Number 2, we talked about why we need to be teachers of the gospel. And the quick answer to that is because whether we are teachers or not determines the eternal destination for many, many people around us, including ourselves. Eternity weighs in the balance. And whether a family member or a friend or a co-worker or anybody that we may know in life, whether they go to heaven or whether they go to hell, may largely depend on the attitude that we bring into this discussion of being teachers. But also, not only did we talk about how that the souls of others hang in the balance, but ours do as well. Because this is an expectation that our God has placed upon our shoulders, a command. And just like any other command that God has emboldened us to submit to, we're going to be held accountable to it. When we stand before God at the day of judgment, we're going to be held accountable for whether we have or have not been active in spreading the gospel of Christ to all those in the world who so desperately need it. And so it's not just the case that the souls of those in the world hang in the balance, so do ours. And that should make it a very, very personal matter. And number 3 tonight, I know I should have been clicking this the whole time. Sometimes I get caught up talking. Number 3 tonight, we're going to ask and answer this question about who should we be looking to teach? Who is it that is our target audience? What demographic, per se, are we trying to seek to impact? Well, you remember some of the last words that Jesus ever spoke to His disciples, Matthew chapter 28, when He commanded, didn't just authorize, but commanded His disciples to do what? To go into all the world and to teach all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Later in Acts chapter 1, just before He ascended back to the Father, the last words He ever said to His disciples patterned much of what He said back in Matthew 28 or Mark 16 or Luke 24. When He said, "And ye shall be witnesses unto me here in Jerusalem." But notice He didn't limit the scope of what He was trying to accomplish to just Jerusalem. He said, yes, you will be witnesses unto me first in Jerusalem, but then unto Judea, the region surrounding Jerusalem. But then He broadened that scope even unto the region of Samaria, until ultimately He said, you will eventually be intended to go to the uttermost parts of the world. God may have had a specific plan by which the gospel was eventually and systematically going to get to the world, as He mentioned there in Acts chapter 1, taking step by step, first to Jerusalem, then go to the region surrounding Jerusalem into Judea, and then step out of just the Jewish gene pool and go to those Samaritans, those half-blood Jew-Gentile It was a systematic plan, but the intention all along was the gospel to every single soul. And so in the first century, they were told whether a person may be Jew or Greek, whether they be bond or free, whether they be male or female. Galatians 3:28, how does Paul conclude that thought? All are one in Christ Jesus. Meaning that as far as our redemptive purpose is concerned, and the great gift of salvation that God has offered us, that we are all equal. There is no Jew nor Greek. There is no bond nor free. There is no male nor female. As pertaining to redemption and God's purpose to save every single soul under heaven, we are all one in Christ Jesus. And so in the first century, the disciples had no right to restrict anybody from being able to be introduced to the gospel of Christ. And the result of that prevailing attitude was, Colossians chapter 1, Paul's ability to say, "And you being in time past alienated and enemies, and your mind and your evil works, yet now hath He reconciled in the body of His flesh through death, to present you holy and without blemish, unreprovable before Him. And if so be that ye continue in the faith, grounded, steadfast, not moved away from the hope of the gospel which ye heard, which was preached in all creation under heaven, whereof I, Paul, was made a minister." Their intention, their unified purpose as the people of God was the gospel to every soul. And Paul said that within his lifetime, because of that prevailing attitude, it was accomplished. The disciples, in other words, were no more selective in who they were going to approach and seek to impact with the gospel than Jesus was. Do you see Jesus being selective in who He tried to reach with His teaching? No, anybody who was willing to listen. Jesus freely gave His time and His ability to teach. And that is the very same attitude that must prevail in our work for God. We must be consumed and be committed to ensuring that the gospel, as Paul said in 2 Thessalonians 3:1, have free course in our world. But unless we are personally, not collectively, unless we are personally willing and able to teach it, it will not. Who do we need to teach? We need to teach every single soul under heaven the gospel. Every single soul needs it, and that's who we must reach. Number 4, we've talked about what, we've talked about why, we've talked about who. Number 4, let's talk about when. When is it that we should be concerned with teaching the gospel? Well, to answer that question, I want to stop and ask another question for just a minute. And the question I want us to ask to kind of get our minds thinking as to what the ultimate answer to this question is going to be is, what is the gospel capable of doing? Think about that just for a second. Just kind of let that roll through in your mind. What is the gospel capable of doing? What was it designed by God to be able to do? Now, I'm not talking about what the primary, we all know what the primary purpose is, and that is to deliver the redemptive message. And that's one of them. But what all? There are many things the gospel is able to accomplish. God's redemptive purpose, yes, is primary, above all. But think about, in even broader terms than that, what all is the gospel capable of doing? Well, in just a few minutes of thinking about that the other day, these are just a few things that I came up with that the Bible says it is able to do if we allow it to work in the way that it's intended. Number 1, it can ease the pain of the hurting. There are no more comforting words, at least to the child of God, to those who are in pain, than the words found in the Gospel, the words of the Bible. It's able to light the path of the wayward, lost, looking for direction in life. What greater avenue of direction could we possibly find than in God's Word? It's able to comfort the heart of the grieving. It can direct the steps of the sinner. It can sanctify the heart of the penitent. It can give meaning to those that have no direction. It's able to give hope to the lost, and many, many more things that I just simply didn't write down. Gospel is capable of doing a lot, folks. And it's interesting to me that when you go back and you study and you research Bible history, how that every point in Bible history, when men either forgot the message of God or they ignored the message of God, what was the natural result? They spiraled out of control, didn't they? That is probably more of a prevalent theme in the Old Testament than in the New. But think about it through the Bible. You've got the primary example being Israel, God's people. When they either forgot or they ignored God's law, what happened? They experienced their darkest days. But you see that very same illustration extended into the lives of other nations as well. Whether it be Edom is a nation in the Old Testament that's really put under the spotlight of examination. And Obadiah spends some time condemning, crying out against the nation of Edom, the descendants of Esau, because of their ungodliness and their refusal to accept God's terms. What about the Assyrians? That's the whole premise of the book of Jonah, in a sense. I mean, outside of Jonah's personal struggle, was Jonah not called to go to the Assyrians, who were such a wicked nation to begin with? Why? Because they had rejected God's message, His law. And that same story can be played out time after time after time, regardless of what nation it might be. When that nation, that group of people, or even that individual person forgot or rejected God's law, they experienced complete and total chaos. I think that fact is summed up as well as it possibly can be in Hosea's statement, Hosea 4:6. You remember when he said that my people are destroyed. Why? For lack of knowledge, because they'd rejected God. And he said, because thou hast rejected knowledge, God said, I will also reject thee. That thou shalt be no priest to me, seeing thou hast forgotten the law of thy God. I also will forget thy children. And so think about this question in terms of what is the gospel capable of doing? It's capable of easing the pain of the hurting, lighting the path of the wayward, comforting the heart of the grieving, directing the steps of the sinner, sanctifying the heart of the penitent, giving meaning to those without direction, hope to the lost, so many other things. And the pure, simple fact of the matter is that God's people will no longer have the responsibility nor the need to be teachers of the gospel when there is no more pain, and when there is no more hurting, and when there is no more sorrow or impurity or sin. But when is that going to be accomplished? Well, Revelation 21 says, not until we are surrounding the throne of God in heaven itself, which means as long as there is time, as long as there is breath in our body, there is a need now, present, active, now, to be teachers of the gospel of Christ. Is the gospel really as important to our lives, to the lifeblood of this congregation, to the society in which we live and the future of us as a people as we say it is? If so, then we need to always be in search of more and more and more opportunities to be teachers of it. And then number 5, we've talked about the what, the why, the who, and the when. I want us to spend the last several minutes together talking about attitude, approach. How should we teach? Everything that we've said thus far is true. The what, the why, the who, the when, all of that's true, not because I said it, but because it's biblical, because God said it. And that means that we ought to accept it and try to live it out every day to the best of our ability. But with that being said, we also have a responsibility of doing this, teaching others, according to some very key principles, with some very specific attitudes or mindsets or demeanors that define us. It should never be the case that we look at God's command to be teachers and assume that that is a mandate for us to be able to say whatever we want, whenever we want, to whoever we want, in whatever manner we want to, and assume that they ought to just be willing to accept it. And sometimes we do that and just stand in awe of wonder as to why this person is not willing to accept what we are ramrodding down their throat in as unloving as a way as we possibly can. Has God given us the expectation to be teachers of His Word? If you say no, then everything we've talked about so far has been in vain. Yes, He's given us the expectation. Has He given us the mandate of His own authority to go and to teach His message? Absolutely. I mean, when we go and teach others, by whose authority are we speaking? When I stand in this pulpit and speak to whoever is in the pews, by whose authority am I speaking of my own authority? If so, then every one of you ought to get up and walk out right now. Because I have no right to tell you anything of my own authority. I ain't got none. The only mandate that we have as being teachers of the gospel is the delegated authority of God bestowed upon us through His Word. And that means not only do I need to teach people what He has told me to teach, but I need to teach people in the way that He told me to teach them. Thus, 6 key attitudes that need to define us in our efforts of being teachers of the gospel. Number 1, at least I think it's 6. I might have lost count. We'll just see. Number 1, how do we need to teach? Number 1, we need to teach with love. And I know that I say that, and sometimes I get this idea, nobody here, but I get this idea that I could say that in some groups of New Testament Christians, and kind of like we talked about last week, I'd kind of get this eye roll. Oh, he's just getting into that gooey garbage again. Oh, we got to teach the gospel in love, and this idea that we've been nurtured in some way into assuming that anytime we talk about doing something out of love, then it means we've turned soft, and that is just simply not the case. I say we need to be teachers of the gospel in love, not because I think it's the best way, even though I do. That's not why I say it. I say we need to be teachers of the gospel in love because that's what the Bible says. Look at Ephesians chapter 4, beginning in verse 11. He said, He gave some to be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, some pastors and teachers. Why? Well, for the perfecting of the saints, unto the work of ministering, unto the building up of the body of Christ, till we all attain unto the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, unto a full-grown man. He's talking about all of those individuals who fill these roles as apostles or prophets or evangelists or pastors or teachers. He says those people, either past or present, fill those roles with these purposes in mind to perfect the saints, to minister, to build up the body, to seek unity in the faith, to seek unity of the knowledge of the Son of God, to grow up. Notice there, unto a full-grown man. He's telling us to grow up. Unto the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ, that we may be no longer children, tossed to and fro, carried about with every wind of doctrine, by the sleight of men and craftiness after the wiles of error. But, he said, don't give in to any of this stuff I've just mentioned. But instead, speaking truth in love, we may grow up in all things in Him who is the head, even Christ. You know, it's sad. I've actually heard people try to explain away the idea that Paul is clearly presenting there, that a prevailing attitude in everything that we do and say as teachers of the gospel of Christ should be said and done from an attitude of love. I have heard New Testament Christians, I have heard gospel preachers try to explain that away. And basically say, well, that's not really what Paul's talking about there. He's talking about a love for something, not a love for the people or a prevailing love toward those you're teaching. He's talking about a love for something else. That means you can hammer people as hard as you possibly want. And you know what I want to do to those people? I just want to slap them right across the face because they have missed the point. Why can't we just let Paul speak for himself? The Holy Spirit speak for Himself. And do what He told us to do and speak the truth in love. Are we supposed to love people? Yes. If we walk away from a study of the Bible with any other opinion about that matter, then we have not studied the Bible very hard. Just pure and simple. We are called by God to love people. And this kind of is an extension of our discussion from last week. How do we treat those people that we love? We treat them in a special way with honor and respect and dignity. Unlike the way sometimes we treat people that we do not agree with. And because we don't agree with them, we just assume we have the right to degrade them and call them names and put them down and do everything in the world to just discredit them. When in reality, we wouldn't do that to anybody else that we claim to love, would we? Paul said, speak the truth in love. So if we're going to be teachers of the gospel, number one, we need to do it in love. Not because I said so. Not just because I think that's the best way to do it, even though I do. The only reason I think it's the best way to do it is because that's what God said. Do it in love. Number two, we need to teach the truth with sincerity. 2 Corinthians 1, Paul was telling his brethren about the struggles and the successes that he had experienced as of late. And in verse 12, notice he said, 2 Corinthians 1:12, rejoicing in this, the testimony of our conscience, that in simplicity and godly sincerity, not with fleshly wisdom, but the grace of God, we have had our conversation in the world and more abundantly to you. He said their teaching efforts were defined by a sincerity, a simplicity, yes, but a godly sincerity toward both the truth that they taught and the souls that they were seeking to impact by it. We need to be sincere when we take the gospel to people. We mentioned Jonah a few minutes ago and how much of the story of Jonah, at least in the early chapter, had to do with the great wickedness of Assyria, Nineveh, the capital city of Assyria. But you know, the real moral of that story is what? The insincerity of Jonah. In number one, not wanting to go and teach those wicked people to begin with. But then number two, after God kindly reminded him that he was God and Jonah was not, that Jonah finally agreed to go, but went with what prevailing attitude? Well, he basically went to Nineveh with the attitude that said, Lord, I'll go because you told me to go, and because basically I don't want to be swallowed by a whale again. I'll go because you told me to go, and I'll tell them what you want me to tell them, but I still hope they reject it, and you have to inflict your punishment upon them. That's what happened. That's why he delivered the message in chapter 3 and then went up on the side of the hill overlooking the city after he got done. Why? Because he wanted a front row view of Nineveh's destruction. Because he hoped all along that even though he preached penitence to them, that they would reject it, and God would rain down that fire and brimstone on them and kill every one of them. That's what he wanted. And so he might have taught them the truth, but guess what? He did not do so in a sincere manner, because he taught it to them all the while hoping they would be lost. If we're not careful among those with whom we have aught, those that we have some disagreement or bad blood with or something of that nature, we might begrudgingly teach them the truth just purely out of responsibility, all the while in the back of our minds hoping that they reject it and that they get what's coming to them, right? That's insincere. That's not right. Number one, we need to teach the truth in love. Number two, we need to do it with sincerity. Number three, we need to teach people the truth with humility. James 1, beginning in verse 22, James said, Be ye doers of the word and not hearers only, deluding your own selves, for if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer. What's he like, James? Well, he said he's like unto a man that beholds his natural face in a mirror. And he beholds himself, and he goes away, and as soon as he's gone, he immediately forgets what manner of man he was. It's almost like James is saying the person who is a hearer of the word and not a doer, an active participant in the purpose of the gospel, he's like a person who looks in the mirror and sees just how ugly he is, and then turns and walks away and immediately thinks he's the most beautiful person in the world. Like the terms of the gospel don't apply to him, spiritually speaking. Like he has hung the moon and nothing in the world can touch him. James says, no, we can't approach the gospel with that attitude. We need to do so with an attitude of humility. Time after time after time. We see Jesus, we see the inspired writers emphasizing the importance of humility. On a repeated basis, you see Jesus telling a parable or relating an account. And the moral of the story is, those who exalt themselves will be abased or humbled by God. But those who humble themselves will be exalted. We've been called to humble ourselves and know that without God, without His redemptive message, without the sacrifice of His Son, we are no better than anybody else in this world. We're not. We might as well get that chip off our shoulders right now. Outside of our relationship with God, outside of the impact that the sacrifice of His Son has made upon us, outside of our acceptance of His redemptive message, we are no better than anybody else in this world. That is humility, and that is the attitude with which we need to approach the taking of the gospel to the lost. Number 4, we need to teach people the truth with reverence. Hebrews 12 and verse 28, the writer said, Wherefore, receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, let us have grace whereby we may offer service well-pleasing to God with reverence and awe. For our God is a consuming fire. I know the statement there is generic, that we offer service to our God, but is the teaching of the gospel not a service rendered unto God? And if it's a service rendered unto God, then does it not need to meet the terms that the writer just stated here in verse 28? that service that we extend unto others as we extend unto God be done in reverence and awe, a reverence for the God of heaven. This means that when we take that message to people, we teach His Word and it alone, as we stated earlier. We allow His Word to explain itself, to interpret itself as it is well capable of doing. We don't seek to change it. We don't seek to manipulate it. We don't seek to teach it for the sake of trying to make ourselves sound smart. We teach it to be effective in communicating that message to people who otherwise are going to be lost without it. It was Paul who said that he was not the most eloquent of speakers. He wasn't concerned with trying to make himself sound good. His sole concern was in being an effective communicator of the gospel of Christ. That's an attitude of reverence toward the Word itself. The same attitude we need to have. Then number 5, we need to approach our teaching of the gospel to people with an attitude of boldness. Time after time, the pattern we see in the first century teachers and preachers reflects a sense of boldness in their speech. I've got a number of passages that I was going to refer to. I'm not going to read all of them right now for time's sake, but look at just a couple. Acts 9 and verse 20, Acts 9:27, this is immediately after Paul's conversion. It says that Barnabas kind of took Paul under his wing. He was going to take him and vouch for him. People didn't like Paul. Paul had killed people like them, Christians. And so they were immediately kind of dismissive of Paul, you remember. They didn't want to receive him unto themselves. They didn't want to trust him. And so Barnabas, son of encouragement, son of exhortation, he stepped up and said, Paul, you stick with me and I'm going to take care of you. So Acts 9:27, Barnabas took Paul, brought him to the apostles, and declared unto them, he vouches for him, how he had seen the Lord in the way, how he had spoken to him, and how at Damascus he, Paul, had preached boldly in the name of Jesus. Acts 13:46, after the two had begun working on a more close basis, Paul and Barnabas spoke out boldly, Luke records, and said it was necessary that the Word of God should first be spoken to you, seeing ye thrust it from you, and judge yourselves unworthy of eternal life. Acts 14:2, Acts 18:24 through 26, Acts 19:5, all passages that refer to the example of the Christians of the first century approaching their efforts to teach the gospel of Christ boldly. Not out of fear, not in a shy and timid manner, but boldly, knowing that the message that they had from God was the truth and unafraid to voice what that truth was. If we want to be effective and be taken seriously for our efforts as we teach, we had better do that with boldness as well. Now, I'm not going to say these are the only attitudes that we need to carry into this work with us, but I think these are 5 that we would do well to pay special attention to if we want to be effective. Not if we want to be known, not if we want to be feared, not if we want to have our name out there, if we want to be effective. And there is a big difference in that. Ultimately, as we educate ourselves with Scripture, we, I think, are going to develop a common sense approach to how we should teach, how we can approach different groups, where we should begin when we study or teach others, how we can determine what areas of emphasis we need to have with different people. Those are all questions that I hear from people from time to time, unsure about their ability to step in and effectively teach someone. Where am I supposed to start? How do I approach this situation? Or this person has this type of background. Where should I begin with them? What should I emphasize? You can't give a blanket statement to that. Those are things that really you just have to develop a common sense approach to as you do it more and more. And so as much as we should know what we teach, we better know how to teach too, because how we teach is going to have about as much of an ultimate impact on our effectiveness toward others as our ability to know what we teach. It's got to be a balanced combination of the two. Now, as important as it is that we all be active teachers of the gospel, this is not a responsibility that we ought to enter into lightly either. The words of James 3 and verse 1 continually run through my mind. James said there, "Brethren, be not many of you teachers." Wait a minute, what James? Be not many of you. We just spent the last hour and a half or so of our time together both this morning. We've spent a significant amount of time tonight saying we all need to be teachers. And now you wrap up by saying James wrote that we should not be many teachers? Well, let him finish his thought. He said, "Be not many of you teachers, my brethren, knowing that we shall receive heavier judgment." That should be a very sober reminder to us that while God has called each of us to teach, that He's also called each of us to prepare ourselves for how to do that. Now, the fact that James says we'll receive a heavier judgment is not said to discourage anyone from being a teacher, because God's called us all to teach. We all have that responsibility. We're all going to be held accountable by that. There's not one that's going to be exempt from that responsibility. No, what James is saying here is said more out of a sobriety of mind, that as we step in to fulfill this responsibility, we better do so with clear eyes, full hearts, realistic as to what we're facing, what we're approaching, and the responsibility that we've taken upon ourselves, and the fact that we're going to be held accountable for what we say to people, how we treat people, what preparation we've brought in to this effort. Let's be sure that we are devoted to the truth that's able to save the souls of men before we assume that we can teach it to others. And if we'll do that, if we'll be devoted to that truth, and then commit ourselves and devote ourselves to teaching that to others, we're going to be just fine, because that's exactly what God has called us to do. Be teachers. Be prepared to teach. Know how to teach. But above all, do it. And there's no more rewarding thing that we can possibly do in life. This month we've talked about being better in a lot of different respects, and I hope these three areas we don't just try to limit in a sense, but that we allow these three things that Paul talked about to kind of broaden our understanding of how we can apply these to so many different areas of our lives. But ultimately, even though we should strive to be better and better and better and grow and grow and grow, ultimately we need to come to the reality that there is no greater life that we could live. There's no greater identity that we could have than that of a Christian. And if you're here tonight and you're not a Christian, then you're missing out on what is the greatest experience that you could possibly have. And we hope that tonight, if you're not a child of God, that you'll become one. If you believe Jesus is God's Son and you're willing to repent of your sin, confess your faith, be immersed in water to contact Jesus' blood, please, please, please come tonight and do that. Maybe you've done it in the past, but you're not living faithfully any longer. You, at some point in the past, turned your back on God and you need to come back. Turn from that sin, confess it, seek His forgiveness through prayer, and He promises that He'll give it to you. Tonight, if you want that greatest lifestyle you can possibly have, and you want to continue to grow to be the better you that you know that you can be, start now by giving your life over to God as together we stand and sing.
What can wash away my sin? Nothing but the blood of Jesus. What can make me whole again? Nothing but the blood